YouTube, it's your boy Killer Cam, back with another reaction. Today we got Scrap Life Lee. I won a Corvette hiding a $30,000 engine at auction. Louis, and it's a C6. I ain't gonna hold you. Street speed got me wanting a C6. That's like a twin turbo, supercharged, whatever, make that motherfucker fast, nitrous, all that shit. But yeah, let's get right into it.
When I won this supercharged Corvette at the salvage auction, I had no idea how big of a home run I just hit. When I placed my bid, there were only three things I knew for sure. The car was totaled because it had a small engine bay fire, there was a supercharger under the hood, and somebody had started stealing parts off of it. In the auction pictures, you can see somebody took the wheels, the brakes, and even some of the interior. And the problem here is, when somebody takes stuff like that, you can bet 99 times out of 100, they started stripping the engine too. I've got burned on cars like this in the past so many times that I almost always avoid buying them. Maybe it's my love of Corvettes, specifically Inferno Orange Corvettes, but I ignored my better judgment, bought it, and it seems this time at least stupidity has paid off. The engine bay, at least from what I can tell from briefly going over it, is exactly how it should be. Nothing's been removed, nothing's been messed with, except the whole fire thing, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there's the supercharger. I knew it had one. I didn't know, however, that it was a YSI capable of over 1,000 horsepower. The entire kit, down to the intercooler and the grill, the piping that goes under the car, even the blow-off valve, it's all in perfect shape. From there, the good news just keeps on coming. The brake calipers that we thought were missing, they're not. They're just jammed behind the wheels, which probably explains why we couldn't turn the thing. I assumed that when they removed the wheels that belonged on this car and replaced them with these junkers, the brake calipers wouldn't clear them, so they just secured them up under the car. Or, well, they made their best effort to secure them under the car. It's so incredibly rare to buy a car from the salvage auction and have it show up with more parts than you originally anticipated. But of course, we're still talking salvage auction cars, so it's not all good news. At some point, there's been some really, and I mean really bad work done to this car. The fuel system, it is all over the place. There's a bunch of random fittings. It's just a really poor job, and it's probably why this car caught on fire in the first place. The wiring, it's some of the worst I've seen. There's missing bolts everywhere, and there's no less than a value pack of Harbor Freight.
You mess up the fuel wiring, the fuel hoses and stuff. What you expect?
Zip ties holding this engine bay together. Luckily, if that's the right way to put it, most of the shoddy work up here is damaged by the fire anyway, so we can rebuild it all the right way. As for the rest of the car, it's absolutely beautiful. The body all the way around is just gorgeous. It is, after all, the best Corvette color ever produced. The only real damage is this on the driver door. I don't know what the deal is with this. Maybe it was the fire department trying to pry the door open after it caught on fire. Either way, it shouldn't be too bad of a fix. Then as for the interior, it's dusty, it's a little dirty, but it is in really nice shape. Other than the missing driver airbag and some very questionably installed gauges, it's all you could ever want from a salvage auction buy. All that, it's awesome, but it is small potatoes compared to this.
You got a Hellcat block on it?
No, but it is orange. Now if you're in the Chevys or LS's in general, you already know how special that is. And if not, well, explain. The engine that's supposed to come in this car, and the engine I thought I was getting, is a 6.2 liter aluminum LS3. And they are, by every metric, an awesome engine, but if your goal is to make really big horsepower, like say with a very large supercharger, they're not gonna cut it for long. If you really want to make big power, if you want to push the limits, you gotta switch to an aftermarket engine block like the LSX we just found. The LSX blocks are designed to do one very specific thing, and that's hold a lot of power without turning to dust. Unlike the LS3 that came in this car from the factory, the LSX, it's cast iron, which on its own means it can handle a lot more abuse. The real advantage on these blocks, though, is what they did when it comes to cylinder head mounting. On factory LS engines, there are 4 main head bolts that secure the cylinder head to the short block per cylinder, as you can see on this engine that used to be an LS7. Most of the aftermarket blocks, though, these were redesigned with 6 bolts per cylinder. And what that means, more or less, is that they're capable of handling a lot of boost, which I plan to test. Well, they make the LSX block in a lot of different sizes, from 6.2 liters all the way up to over 8. The most common is the 427 cubic inch 7 liter. As for what ours is, I don't know. So let's tear it apart and find out.
I was so wondering what's he gonna say. They probably got a 7-liter in that motherfucker. He got a supercharger.
I'll pipe this thing up so much at this point, it's gonna be real awkward. We drain the oil and chunks of metal start coming out. You know, oil looks like glitter.
Oh, no water on it.
Yeah, it doesn't look like demon. We've seen it all here. This looks all right.
A little bit dirty, but
I'll take it. Dirty is fine. Full of water, glitter, metal, or other foreign substances is not. The plug itself has a little bit of material on it. It's not anything too horrendous. It's magnetic, so you kind of expect to have this little bit of sludge. On one hand, the idea that this thing was built with really nice parts still holds up. We found this really nice transmission brace setup on it, and yes, if this is your first time under a Corvette, the transmissions are in the rear. They're connected via a torque tube instead of a traditional drive shaft, and what this transmission brace does is give this transmission and differential assembly at least a shot of staying in one piece when you're making crazy power like this. On the other hand though, we've got just the hackiest, what I have to imagine are exhaust cutouts, welded, if we can even call that welding, into the X-pipe. Luckily, with the way I plan on building this car, it doesn't necessarily need an exhaust, so I'm not too worried about it. Let me clarify. It doesn't necessarily need an exhaust coming out the back of the car. But then there's the fact that we have 2 driver side brake rotors, which isn't the biggest deal in the world. I'm much more concerned about the fact that we have 0 passenger side front brake calipers. I wrongfully assumed it was tucked up under the car like the rest of the calipers, but the hose, it's straight cut off. Maybe it happened when it was being loaded on transport, which means it's probably on the side of a highway somewhere between Chicago and here. Unlike the exhaust, we will need brakes. We will have to source a passenger brake caliper. Luckily, they're not too horrendously expensive. Missing parts aside though, everything's coming apart really smoothly. We haven't found any weird, crazy damage on the chassis, so we can't really be too mad at it. Now, despite what most people think, being that the transmissions are in the rear of these cars, they're ultra easy to work on. Outside of disconnecting the brake lines and a few pieces of wiring, all we have to do is disconnect the control arms from the chassis and the torque tube from the bell housing. Now, the only thing stopping this whole rear end assembly from falling straight out of the car are 4 nuts just like that holding the rear subframe in. But, you know, assuming we don't want the shifter and the center console to rip through the floor with our running gear, it would probably be a wise idea to zip those off. And this is where this car being a targa top really comes in handy. Don't get me wrong, they do have their issues. That, along with the just horrendous squeaking that they're known for,
people that where the top flew off their Corvette,
are just a few of the reasons why I'm not going to keep this car a targa top, but I sure will enjoy it while it lasts. That's a nice little bonus. When I was pulling the center console up, there were a few wires hardwired going through the ashtray. It's a passport radar laser detector jammer system, which I assume are what those black boxes in the front bumper are for. Personally, I kind of find all the beeping annoying, so I'll probably end up stripping that out, selling it, and spending the money on Go Fast parts. One thing we definitely will be reusing on the build though is this MGW short shifter. Now traditionally, I hate short shifters. They're not cheap, I just don't like them. But whatever magic they used when they made this thing, they nailed it. And now that we got the shifter out of there, we can knock off these last few subframe bolts, separate the input shaft from our clutch disc, and lift the body up off the entire rear half of the drivetrain. Now that we got this whole back half of the drivetrain out of the car, you can get a lot better idea of how this transmission brace works. There's a plate that bolts here to the front of the transmission, and then 2 more plates that bolt to the side of the rear differentials. From there, there's bars top and bottom. The idea being that it squeezes everything together, it stops a lot of the flexing that can happen between the diff and the transmission, which should help protect against things like that. But for this build, I have some truly, and I mean truly ignorant goals with the car, to the point where I don't think all the transmission bracing in the world will keep this thing together. So this time, we're switching to a completely different manual trans and diff.
Damn, he's finna go crazy on that.
And as for exactly how ignorant this build is going to be, we'll talk about that once we get the engine out of the car. But before we start wrenching on it, there's just one more thing I want to do for disaster avoidance purposes. these things tend to get pretty unstable when you drop a rear half of the drivetrain out or the engine out by itself instead of doing it all at once. So I always like to just weigh down the hatch with whatever I have laying around. In this case, it's the brake rotors and a bunch of fuel parts. And then when I'm done doing whatever I'm doing with the rear end, I'll always throw the subframe right back in it, even if I'm not putting a transmission in it right away. We might do some dumb stuff here once in a while, but dropping a car off a lift just seems, I don't know, excessive.
Exactly. Dropping a car off a lift is crazy.
I do just have to take a second here and appreciate the ingenuity that went into the mounting of this intercooler pipe, blow-off valve assembly. It's just next level stuff that I really haven't seen before. Oh, the zip tie is secured by a zip tie. Amazing. What a beaut. All right, we're gonna play a little game here because we have two catch cans, two guys here. We're gonna play what's in the catch can. To be clear here, the silver one, that was attached to the back side of that valve cover. The orange one, that was attached just to the dry sump tank. Have at it. Which one do you want? You're taking the one that looks nastier visually?
It's kind of empty. Is it a good sign or bad sign?
I guess we'll find out.
Could be sludge. Remember,
Why it look like water?
That's beautiful. I can't tell if that's water, rust, or like coolant, which wouldn't make any sense. Well, it's nasty, but there's not much of it. It's just like brown, rusty type water that I just poured on my shoe.
Why does it smell like gas?
Gas? He ain't lying. It does smell like E85.
What?
So another one of those catch cans.
Let this serve as your official PSA to drain your catch cans. One thing they did on this car that's actually pretty cool is they repurposed the washer fluid bottle to a reservoir for an alcohol injection system. How these systems work is you'll have a reservoir full of either methanol or alcohol, and this pump, based on a certain set of parameters like RPMs, throttle position, or anything you want, will inject it into the intake tract through these little nozzles, which are replaceable just like nitrous jets. It'll let you make more power and effectively make your 93 octane act more like race gas. Now, if you're running race gas or E85 like we're gonna be, this really just becomes an unnecessary complication, so we're just gonna axe it. One thing I will keep, as long as it's a decent brand, is this alternator. Vets have charging problems from the factory, so MechMan. Okay, they're decent, I've heard of them before, and
Made in USA.
love to see that, right? Once again, no surprise here, but the engineering assembly genius on this car just continues. I was following some lines and getting ready to pull this engine out, and I saw these guys. They look like OEM oil cooler lines, but they are going somewhere where the OEM oil cooler definitely does not go. I don't know that you guys can see it, but between that black heat shield for the intercooler and the bumper, there's an aftermarket oil cooler tucked back there. And the reason why I'm making such a big deal about that is it has absolutely zero airflow, and I mean truly zero.
Exactly.
I guess technically it's better than not having one at all, but geez. This is taking far longer than it should have. Just trying to digest all the garbage we found here, but I think we're ready to come out, hopefully. We're looking nice and clear and really toasty on the back. Around the driver's side, we got everything. We got the steering shaft, that's off. On the front, we got our brake lines disconnected, ABS units out. The blower, that's gonna clear the frame rail. This is our body harness, this isn't attached to the engine. Got our AC lines, our coolant lines. This header's already loose. We've got this big mess of wiring that goes down into the fender for the ECU, which is far and away the most annoying area to work on Corvettes. That's all out. I think we're good. I think for once, didn't miss anything. I can't tell if things are hung up or it's just stuff cracking and creaking because everything's fire roasted.
Send it.
Yeah, this would probably be a fantastic idea. You know, it looked better in the car, and once I knew what engine was in this car, I kind of changed the original goal I had for it when I thought I was buying a car with an LS3 in it. I thought it'd be an awesome challenge to try to make 1,000 horsepower on an unopened stock Corvette engine from the salvage auction. But on this thing, that's just too easy. So new plan, we're gonna take this crispy salvage auction LSX and build the fastest, highest horsepower car I've ever owned. Call it 1,500 horsepower, 8-second quarter mile. Oh, and let's try to do it without opening the engine.
How the hell he gonna do that?
I'm just hoping that we don't find anything catastrophic here that makes this whole deal harder than it's already gonna be. You got deja vu right now, Fernando?
To be honest with you, for some reason this feels like the Demon 2.0.
Pulling off a burnt up bell housing with a melted up wiring harness above it, it just feels all too familiar. I am at least relatively confident that this engine's not going to be quite as bad as that one was, though. Now, while I intend to reuse the core components of the engine, the short block, the cylinder heads, hopefully without opening them, almost everything that's attached to the engine is going to have to be upgraded, including this clutch. It's a McLeod. I haven't seen this particular version with the gold flywheel before.
Whoa.
Yeah, she's a little rusted up. These are nice clutches, and I'm sure a lot of this is just from the fire, maybe the smoke, the water damage, and just from it sitting, but it's hard enough to get a normal, brand new clutch to hold 1,000 horsepower, especially if you don't want your car to be a dyno queen. So this is one area we're gonna have to find a legitimate solution for if we have any hope of putting this power to the ground reliably. To be clear, I didn't loosen that. Let's see something here.
Oh, wow.
What the hell?
Assuming these don't call for like, I don't know, half an inch pound, these were not properly tightened at all.
Is it me or this clutch has been through some abuse?
A fair share of abuse, probably. But to be fair, you don't build a car like this to not abuse it, right? That's what it's for. That's what we're going to do with it when we finish it, so.
That's a good point.
It's the right kind of abuse, but man, that is awfully rough. Check that out. LSX, baby. Now comes the scary part. The fun part, but also the scary part. We know we got a really cool engine here. We have no clue what kind of shape it's in, and I do have just minor concerns.
They already
Numero uno, we have leaks all over this thing. The whole engine's pretty moist, but I do think a lot of that's coming from, say, the power steering pump and stuff that's not directly related to the engine. The more pressing concern I have here, though, is the color of these exhaust ports. Some of them look really lean, others really rich, and that could point to a multitude of issues that could have not great implications for the health of this engine.
It's black as hell.
That could mean our injectors were performing inconsistently, maybe fuel pressure was dropping off, or maybe we were even running out of fuel because these stock fuel rails, every one of those things can destroy an engine in a hurry, so let's just hope it's not the case on ours. Now, as for our ignition coils, the LS coil packs, they're awesome. You can make a ton of power on them, but even on the side that didn't get toasted, they're all just cracked up. They're generally just in poor shape. The side that did have the fire on it, they're not melted, but 2 of these are cracked, so we're gonna have to thoroughly test the ones that aren't cracked before we even consider reusing them. One thing I am genuinely interested to see here is what fuel injectors they have in it. Whew, okay, turns out they're a lot easier to get off when the plugs aren't melted. Whew, we got a little fuel in her still. A lot of fuel in her still.
What kind of fuel is it?
E85 for sure. You build a car like this, it just doesn't make sense to run it on pump gas. Once you experience high horsepower, you just can't put a worse fuel in it and make less power. It's no fun. These are pretty much the best of the best. Injector Dynamics ID 1700X. 1700cc injectors. It's a decent bit of injector. Surely could have supported this. They're also like $2,000, which is wild to me. It's a true shame that half of them are compromised by fire. I don't think it's ever a great sign when you look down in your injector bosses and there's fire extinguisher material. There's really not a lot in this life that I won't try to salvage or rebuild, but something about using an injector with a melted plastic housing, that's just no bueno. I do have a 6-cylinder project coming up though, and only 2 of these are truly damaged by fire, so maybe this was just fate.
Can we say the brand?
What brand? Well,
Something
you can see the brand of what?
of the 6-cylinder that is coming.
It's the 6-cylinder. The 6-cylinder.
The 6-cylinder. I don't know.
With our wiring harness removed, that's about it for melted garbage on this car. So now we can get down to
favorite
business.
6-cylinder is the
Specifically,
CT,
supercharger
4V.
business. Now this blower, seeing that in the auction pictures is the sole reason we own this car. And if this was an LS3, like I assumed, it would have been perfect. It would have let us make our 1,000 horsepower and we really wouldn't have had to do anything to it. Not only is it the big YSI with a fist-size inducer wheel, but the more we get into this engine, the better the blower setup gets. Traditionally, these blowers run off the standard 6-rib accessory drive, the same one that's used by the alternator and the power steering. The problem with that on a blower, especially one of this size, a 6-rib belt, it's not a lot of contact on the pulley, and it can lead to belt slip, which is why they've changed to an 8-rib setup on this. Not only did they go wider on this setup, though, they configured it so the blower has its own independent belt, meaning it doesn't share it with the power steering or alternator any longer. Instead, now the alternator and power steering are ran off the AC belt. The AC belt comes across the crank pulley instead of staying just on the passenger side of it and spins this little 4-rib section on this aftermarket pulley that they added. From there, this front 6-rib section runs up across the power steering and then up to the alternator, meaning this now runs 3 belts instead of the 2 that come from the factory. It really is the perfect blower setup. They sound freaking awesome. But this LSX is capable of taking just a little more abuse than this guy can throw out. Now the very last piece of the blower kit we got to get off the car is this crank pulley. It's an overdrive crank pulley, meaning it's bigger this way. Every rotation of the crankshaft spins the supercharger more, therefore more boost. But we aren't putting a supercharger at all back on this thing. After all, why run one supercharger when we can run 2 turbos?
I knew that was coming.
The alternative was, of course, to Hellcat swap it, but frankly, everyone around the shop's quite tired of hearing Fernando make blower noises, so we had to rule that one out. On that note, what do you think these bad boys are gonna sound like?
I can't believe you're replacing the whee for like the whatever it is.
You got some work to do on that one. Sound effects aside, as soon as the new twin turbo was the plan, I hit up our guys at Garrett and they decided to come on as a partner for the build. They help us spec everything out to make sure this car doesn't end up as some lazy Dyno Queen show car, but rather something that's going to perform on the track every single time. As for the turbos, it's a pair of G40 1100s, meaning each one's capable of 1150 horsepower. Now, I'm not the best at math, I never claimed to be, but by my calculation, it's about 2,300 horsepower, which will turn even this engine into that one scene from Oppenheimer.
Bro,
but the good thing about these turbos is even though they're capable of wild horsepower like that, they're ultra efficient even when they're not maxed out, meaning we can get our 1,500 horsepower and have room to grow later if we decide to build an even crazier engine at some point. And while I have ran Garrett G-Series turbos before, specifically on my 911 turbo where I ran twin G30s,
I need some twin
I've
turbo.
never ran their wastegates or blow-off valves, so we're gonna try those 2 on this build. Now, as you might imagine, I'm beyond excited to get cracking on the turbo kit build for this car, but before we can do that, we got just a little more detective work to do. As for what's left on the engine that we can actually reuse, I think the throttle body is one of those parts. It's a 102mm throttle body, which is 4 inches. It looks like a decent piece, though it is unbranded. It does have some silicone on the backside of it, which isn't a great sign, but we are going to try to reuse it. One thing that unfortunately we're not going to be able to reuse is this intake manifold, and that sucks because it is a really nice one. They're one of the go-tos to upgrade your naturally aspirated LS. They make great power, they look really cool too, even where it was worst impacted by the fire. It's compromised, but it doesn't look like it's totally destroyed. Maybe you'd have to replace the gasket that seals the upper part to the lower part. If we were naturally aspirated, I'd probably consider resealing it and reusing it, but I'm not going to shove 20 pounds of boost through it. As for the intake manifold that's going on this build, I have something just gnarly on the way, but that is a story for later. Now, it's time to get our first look inside this engine.
Oh, shit.
Beautiful. In fact, the only thing that I can see wrong with it, if you want to call it that, is there's condensation, that milky residue, the same stuff that came out of the catch can, right back where that catch can vent was. Otherwise, everything looks almost brand new. So at least visually, all the valve train's in great shape. It looks really new. The intake ports, that is where aftermarket cylinder heads like this really shine. They're absolutely massive. It might be hard to tell on video, but they are ginormous. They'll far outflow even most CNC ported stock casting heads, which I suppose does make sense given that the heads alone are $4 grand. Now, if the short block is as in good a shape as these cylinder heads, we are going to have ourselves a rocking engine here.
What about that massive oil leak?
This massive oil leak?
Yeah.
I don't know where it's coming from. I still think a lot of this was from the power steering pump. Forgot those were there. It's a little milky. That doesn't surprise me too much. The good news is there's no big collection of metal in the bottom of the oil pan. At least from what we're seeing inside the engine so far, I am way more confident in it than I was before we started pulling it apart. Except that there is one 14-15 millimeter bolt on the windage tray, and the rest of them, they're 13 millimeters. Mismatched hardware inside the engine's never really a good thing, even if it's on the windage tray. That's not something you really like to see. One washer down. Oh, that is pretty. Just like the inside of the heads, this is all in really nice shape.
I'm impressed.
As for what we got inside, the first thing I noticed are these stacked washers on the main cap bolts. There's these little posts that mount the windage tray, and what that does is spaces the windage tray out a little bit to clear a crankshaft with a longer stroke. The next thing that's immediately obvious are these billet main caps. Now this might be standard on an LSX. There are some factory LSs that come with billet main caps, so that's nothing too special. We have ARP hardware throughout, obviously aftermarket rods, and some beautiful gold-coated pistons. And it might be really hard to see, but if you look closely, you can see it says SteveMorrisEngines.com. Steve Morris is a phenomenal builder when it comes to these engines, so I don't quite know what we have here, but that's a good sign, at least so far.
That mug
we
already
have
been cracked open.
Some number right there on the crankshaft that we can't really see because the main cap's in the way. 4000. Okay, 4000, which I presume means it's a 4-inch stroke. On this back rod, there's writing. I just can't make out exactly what it is. 6 1/8 length. What's that say? Ultra? Ultra. Okay. Cali's Ultra rods, 6.125.
Look, he don't even
On the
know
end
what
of the
that is.
post, we have 135764
Look, he finding out he got some more
from
good
2015. Okay, we will have to look this up to see exactly what it means, but it's a 4-inch stroke. That checks out. It's a dry sump. That checks out. Dragon Slayer crank. Sounds cool. The rods, I just looked those up. They're like $2,100. The crank, $2,800. So here's where we stand. Cali's confirmed that these are their rods and their crank. They're both rated to hold the power we need, so we're good there. The only concern is the age. And Tim pointed out that on the oil pan gasket, it also has a 2015 date code, so I truly think the engine is almost 10 years old. As far as the cylinder heads go, I put in a call to PRC and was able to find out that these are the 285cc heads. At this point, we know pretty much everything about this engine except how big it is, so we're going to try to find it out in the most imprecise way possible. What I'm going to do, stick these welding rod chopsticks down here while Tim has the micrometer ready.
How is this telling you?
4.127, I'm sure that's accurate. 4-inch stroke, 8 cylinders, 428. Now, something tells me this isn't a 428. We can probably chalk that 1 cubic inch up to my imprecise measurement methods here, but I'm 100% confident, now at least, in saying that this is a 427. I know everything's adding up to this engine being built in the mid-2000s, 2015-ish, but if it was, it is just so absurdly clean. There's a little bit of carbon on the pistons, but pretty much every cylinder wall looks brand new. The gold coating on the pistons, that is all beautiful. This is honestly one of the best conditioned aftermarket engines I've ever gotten a salvage auction car. 7 liters, seemingly at least all the right parts. The only thing we don't know about this right now, at least, is who built it. The only thing I'm thinking is those Steve Morris pistons that are sitting inside here, they don't appear to be available for sale. They build a lot of these engines there, so maybe it was one of their in-house builds. I do have a call out to them as well. I'm hoping that once I hear back from them, well, heard from Steve Morris, and we got more great news about this engine. We were able to get all the information about those pistons, where Steve Morris contracts out the diamond pistons, and I'm gonna be honest with you guys, can't interpret some of this, but we did confirm our bore size. We confirmed that it's a 427. We also see here that it's a 9-to-1 compression ratio, and quite ironically, it's rated for exactly 1,501 horsepower. Not only that, Steve Morris actually assembled this engine in. They loosely remember this car coming in way back when for a dyno. We found out that it made just over 1,000 horsepower. It was something like 1050. We did also confirm that this engine is indeed almost 10 years old, but hey, everything looks good. We're gonna go for it and see what happens. The only concern I even have about this engine, other than the age of course, is that while the block is made to use those 6-bolt cylinder heads we talked about earlier in the video, the cylinder heads, they are the standard 4-bolt design. They're great heads. They even use a 1/2-inch head stud, which is an upgrade from the standard head studs on the LS, but it's still not gonna provide the clamping force of a true 6-bolt setup. Earlier in the video, I called this thing a home run, but knowing what we know now, knowing what's inside this engine, it's something far beyond that, and I do suppose that now is when the real fun starts. The 2-cylinder, you guys know what I'm talking about. Did I say 2-cylinder? The Big Daddy. Yeah.
Ain't gonna lie, this finna be a crazy build. I think it is. WVid, man, WVid.